Hey everybody, welcome to another multi-game My Thoughts On, where I take a look at a bunch of different games I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I roll them all into one video. And in this particular case, I am taking a look at 5 different anime games. These are games that are either using an anime art style, or they are outright based on manga or anime series. So what I'm going to be taking a look at throughout this video are, in alphabetical order, Code Vein, God Eater, more specifically God Eater Resurrection, which I'll explain more when I get to that section of the video, Jump Force, One Piece Burning Blood, and Sword Art Online Lost Song. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with Code Vein. Code Vein is what a lot of people would describe as a Souls-like. It's a hack-and-slash RPG-ish kind of thing without any real role-playing in it, that was made entirely by Bandai Namco Studios and released in 2019 for PC, Xbox One, and PS4. And while it does certainly try a few things that are pretty different compared to most Souls-likes, like the ability to have an AI partner accompanying you on missions and helping you out, as well as being able to change your class as opposed to being stuck with whatever you start with and then just kind of having to stat around that. My main issue with Code Vein is ultimately the same problem I've had with basically any Souls-like I've played. It's boring. That sluggish and imprecise combat, the constant reliance on dodging out of the way of things, and parrying attacks at just the right moment with a parry window that is really weird most of the time, and doesn't actually correspond all that well with what you're seeing, so you have to basically relearn it on every single enemy type. And that whole process of just trial and erroring the living shit out of the game just results in an experience where I feel like the game is wasting my time. And whenever I feel like my time is being wasted, I will get, first off, irritated, and eventually I will just say that it's not worth finishing. And that's basically what happened with Code Vein. It certainly didn't help that the story is paced very slowly, like a lot of Japanese writing is. And like a lot of Japanese writing that is paced really slowly, they don't give you much to latch on to at the beginning, so you're not going to care all that much about the story as you continue to progress. You're really focusing way more on gameplay than anything else, and when you're focusing on the gameplay, it's just another Souls-like, but with an anime art style and reasonably well done from a technical standpoint. I mean, it runs well, it seems to play mostly fine, it's a bit more forgiving than some of the other Souls-likes out there, but that's not really saying much. It still will just absolutely clobber you sometimes out of nowhere, just because, well, it's a Souls-like and that's what they do. Needless to say, this means that if you like Souls-likes and you're okay with or outright enjoy the anime art style and the anime-as-hell storyline, then you'll probably be able to enjoy Code Vein. But unfortunately in my case, that combat is just too sluggish and too imprecise and too overly reliant on iframes for me to really get much out of. And you may be saying, but DW, just stop wasting your time with Souls-likes. You don't like them, you're never going to like them, and that's that. Well, I really can't agree with that sentiment and write off the entire genre, because I enjoyed the living hell out of Severance Blade of Darkness, and while that certainly doesn't have the recurring death mechanic that Souls-likes do, the combat systems are actually pretty comparable, and since I enjoyed the hell out of the combat in Severance, it stands to reason that if a combat system in a Souls-like were done really well, then I would be able to enjoy them. Which is why I do still keep taking a look at Souls-like titles, because eventually I might actually find one that I enjoy. And if that ever happens, then I will gladly tell you, but so far, every Souls-like I've played has just been this dull, repetitive, overly reliant on trial and error mess, and Code Vein is no exception there. Again, if you're a fan of Souls-likes, you will almost certainly enjoy Code Vein as long as you can put up with the art style. If you don't like anime art styles, then you probably won't be able to enjoy it, but that's just a matter of personal preference there. As far as Souls-like games go, it seems like it's one of the more decent ones out there, at least currently, so maybe give it a shot if you can find it on sale and you happen to like the genre. But if you don't like Souls-likes, this one's not going to change your mind. Next up we have God Eater, more specifically God Eater Resurrection, which is the enhanced PS4, PS Vita, and PC re-release of God's Eater Burst, which was an enhanced PSP re-release of the original God Eater, which was a PSP game. That's a bit confusing, I know. The original God Eater was only released in Japan. God's Eater Burst was released in Japan later on the same year, but it also came to the West the following year, and then God Eater Resurrection was released worldwide. And the only way you can get this on PC is bundled together with God Eater 2 Rage Burst, which is basically the same treatment as God Eater Resurrection, only it's for God Eater 2. I'll cover that in some other video, whether it be a full review or an MTO. I just haven't gotten around to trying that one out yet. But suffice to say, God Eater Resurrection is included, air quotes, for free when you get God Eater 2 Rage Burst. And that's why I have this. I decided to give the God Eater series a try, considering that I had been trying out Monster Hunter, and I wanted to hold off on covering the Monster Hunter series until I gained access to all of the games in it. So I decided until I happen to have copies of all of that, I can at least get an idea of what the genre is like by playing other games in the same genre, and which wouldn't really be burdened by having to find other games that were previous to it that may or may not be readily available. As it turns out, God Eater Resurrection was a pretty bad place to start with that, because the PC port of this game is not very good. Namely, it has two major issues. The first of them is that it's locked at 60 frames per second, which probably doesn't sound that bad, until you realize that the PSP game and the console versions are locked at 30 frames per second for a reason. If the game goes higher than 30 frames per second, then the mechanics and the AI start glitching out, which is, of course, a thing, because of course this game, being a console, really a handheld to-console port, and then that weirdness to PC, in all that mess, of course the original programming ties the game's logic to its frame rate, which is never a good idea in really anything. Because once you deviate from that frame rate, you start running into problems with the mechanics messing up, and if there's any kind of slowdown or any kind of speed up that's present, it's going to cause problems. So pro tip for any aspiring developers out there, don't tie your game's logic to its frame rate. Anyway, moving past that, this thing started out as a relatively straightforward Monster Hunter type game, only it's sci-fi themed and thus all the weapons are completely over-the-top, ridiculous, oversized nonsense that's with an industrial theme rather than it looks like it's made out of monster parts. So there's that. That's a topic for another video entirely, honestly, that just me ranting about the completely unusable nonsense in a lot of Japanese games in particular, but also other fantasy games and other industrial and sci-fi games and such. But I don't want to tie up this video with that because it's really not all that relevant here. Because the main issue I had with this thing that ultimately prevented me from doing anything more than an MTO on it is the controls. Because in case you didn't know, the PSP only has one analog stick, and it uses that analog stick in this case to move your character around. So how do you control the camera? Well, I don't have the PSP version, so I couldn't tell you how it controlled on PSP, but what I can tell you is that when they introduced camera controls to God Eater Resurrection, they did a pretty poor job of it, so you have controls with all kinds of weird sensitivity issues, with the actual camera angle just being too narrow, and it just ends up being kind of a mess to play. Now, I don't know if they fixed this problem with God Eater 2 Rage Burst, but I'm pretty sure it's fixed by the time you get to God Eater 3, so maybe I can give that game a try and actually get an idea for how God Eater is actually supposed to play, instead of just feeling like I'm bashing my head against a wall with this one. And I'll be fair, it's not an issue that's exclusive to God Eater either. There are a lot of PSP games with some really weird control issues, because again, they only had the one analog stick on that, and it's not really an analog stick, it's more like a disc with a nub sticking out of it. It's really weird. So when it comes to certain types of games, the PSP was just a really poor choice of platform, and with other types of games that maybe were working a bit better with more fixed camera angles, it wasn't as much of an issue. Obviously with side-scrollers or tactical JRPGs or things like that, it works fine. But 3D action games, and especially stuff like first and third person shooters, really didn't work all that well on it. But those are topics for another video entirely. The end result with God Eater Resurrection, though, is that while they did have a chance to make it a proper definitive version of God Eater and make it overcome the issues that the PSP had as a platform in general, unfortunately, they didn't really do that, so I basically can't recommend playing God Eater Resurrection at all. As for the other entries in the series, though, well, I'm not going to write them off entirely. Like I said, this is basically a technical problem with the PC port of God Eater Resurrection, and I don't plan on going out and trying to find a PSP copy of God's Eater Burst, and I'm certainly not going to go and get the PS4 version of God Eater Resurrection either. I don't see any point in doing any of that. Hopefully the sequels will turn out better and I'll actually be able to do proper reviews or even just full standalone MTOs of those. We'll have to wait and see though. Next up, we have Jump Force, developed by Spike Chunsoft and published by Bandai Namco, and it was released in 2019 for PS4, Xbox One, and PC. And in November of last year, Bandai Namco announced that they were going to discontinue the game, and that its online servers were going to be shut down in August of 2022. As I'm recording this, they have delisted the game from sale, so it's no longer available on digital storefronts, although you can probably track down a used copy on PS4 and Xbox One, of course. But at least as far as the PC version that you're seeing in this video goes, it's not available for sale anymore. So what is Jump Force exactly? Well, it is a mashup fighting game kind of thing that is styled a lot after the likes of Dragon Ball Xenoverse. Now, in Dragon Ball Xenoverse, you created your own character, and as you progressed, you would be able to unlock a bunch of abilities from various characters throughout the series. So you'd have things like Kamehameha, you'd have things like Gallic Gun, and all that sort of thing that you would gradually unlock as you played the game and learned more from the masters and completed quest lines and such. And it was a pretty neat idea that was pretty awful in the first game, but by the time the second game rolled around, they had more or less worked out the formula, and it ended up being certainly much better than the original Xenoverse, but also a good springboard for things to come, with hopefully a Xenoverse 3 really tying everything together if they ever get around to it. But I digress. Jump Force does something fairly similar in that you create your own avatar character and you select their general fighting style, and then over time you will gradually be able to unlock new abilities that are styled after the various characters that are available in Jump Force. So you've got characters from Bleach, you've got characters from Naruto, you've got characters from Dragon Ball and One Piece, and so on and so forth. A lot of very popular series that are all serialized in Weekly Shonen Jump. Hence, of course, the name Jump Force. And while I can't say that they all make the transition to this new art style that is a sort of 3D look very well, in fact, most of them look kind of awful in this art style, but the art style is really neither here or there. It's a bit off-putting at first, but you gradually get kind of used to it. And once you do get used to the art style, the ridiculousness sets in pretty quickly. I mean, this is a game where you've got characters like Naruto Uzumaki teaming up with Ichigo Kurosaki and trying to beat the crap out of Goku, who is teamed up with Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star. On paper, that is such a ridiculous idea, you can't help but find it amusing. This does, however, present a few issues. The first of them is one that's really not much of an issue at all, which is that it's basically impossible to create a compelling or interesting plot out of any of this. The story in this game is terrible, and you're not going to give a single solitary crap about it the entire time you're playing, because nothing could possibly make you care about a story like this. The thing is, if you want to unlock the entire character roster, you have to play through the entire story. And most of that story is pretty insufferably stupid and revolves around player 1 being awesome. Because of course your avatar character is the savior of the entire damn universe. And since the story is basically insufferably stupid, you're going to focus almost exclusively on the gameplay, which, apart from the ability to customize the look of your avatar character as well as which specific abilities they're using, is a 1v1 tag team fight where you have a group of up to 3 fighters and you can swap between them during the fight, making it play more like the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm series or the game I'll be covering in a moment, One Piece Burning Blood, than Dragon Ball Xenoverse. Obviously, the switch to 1v1 fighting is a much easier thing to handle than the somewhat chaotic stuff you would get in the Xenoverse series, or something like, say, Naruto to Boruto Shinobi Striker. And given that we've had numerous fighting games from Bandai Namco that are set up like that at this point, with the Ultimate Ninja Storm series seeing the most development of that concept, as well as One Piece Burning Blood, which we'll get to in a moment, don't worry, or the more recently released Demon Slayer Hinokami Chronicles, which is basically Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm, but instead of Naruto, it's Kimetsu no Yaiba. Anyway, you would think with all of those kinds of games being developed that Bandai Namco and their developers would have a good grasp of the mechanics. But having played One Piece Burning Blood and now this, both of which were made by Spike Chunsoft instead of the Ultimate Ninja Storm series, which was made by CyberConnect 2, it's become abundantly clear to me that while CyberConnect 2 seems to learn from their mistakes and implement fixes and just slightly tweak things to be better and better with each subsequent game, Spike Chunsoft doesn't seem to have gotten with the program there, and the mechanics of Jump Force are pretty weak. That's not to say that this is a terrible game, but it is to say that the theme doesn't manage to overcome the issues with regards to gameplay that were more or less ironed out in, say, the Ultimate Ninja Storm series by the time they hit the third game. For lack of a better way of describing it, it just feels like the mechanics are a bit sloppy, and it just ends up being not really all that fun of a fighting game because of it. And while it is pretty cool that they managed to get as many characters into the game as they could from as many series as they could, Japanese IPs are notoriously difficult to work with, and I have a feeling that that contributed pretty heavily to why they're shutting down the game so quickly. It probably became prohibitively expensive for them to keep trying to renew the licenses when the game really didn't seem to be doing all that well financially. And that is a shame, because an idea like this could work fairly well if it were done like, say, the Capcom vs. SNK series or something like that, where you do have this crossover mashup fighting game, but it's done in an art style that is very visually appealing and actually works pretty well with the characters that they're going with, instead of just being this weird 3D golem look, and has mechanics that are more refined. But unfortunately, we just didn't get that with Jump Force. Hopefully, if they want to do this kind of thing again, they'll learn from their mistakes with this one and improve things for an eventual follow-up or some other kind of crossover thing, because the end result here was just unfortunately quite mediocre at best. Moving on, we have One Piece Burning Blood, which is a 3D fighting game developed by Spike Chunsoft and published by Bandai Namco in 2016 for PC, PS4, and Xbox One. And with a lot of ports of Japanese games from console to PC, it has a frame rate lock of 30 frames per second, because why would anyone want more than 30 frames per second, clearly? I actually have a feeling that they locked it at 30 frames per second for mechanical reasons. Most likely it has the gameplay logic tied to the game's frame rate, and if it goes any higher than 30 frames per second, it probably breaks. Anyway, frame rate aside, it basically plays very much like Jump Force does, so all of that's going to apply here. And that means it also plays like, say, the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm series and all that. It's a 1v1 3D fighting game where you control up to 3 members of a team, and you can swap those characters in and out of the fight in a sort of tag team mechanic. Only this one also introduces support characters that will give you various bonuses, like if your burning gauge, which is basically your super meter, is full, then it might give you a bonus to attack and defense and all that sort of thing. And while the game does force you into playing story mode first and doesn't let you use a sort of training mode to mess around with controls and make sure you've got all those set up properly, the first so-called episode of the story mode is basically the game's tutorial. It teaches you all of the mechanics you need to know, and it also gives you access to a couple of EX missions, which are side missions that allow you to participate in completely optional fights. And it's a good thing they are optional because they start showing up well before you've learned all the mechanics, well before you've gotten through all the tutorial levels, and they really do require you to know all of the mechanics and have them internalized pretty well, because the difficulty spike between the main missions and the EX missions is massive. So trying one of the EX missions starting out is going to be immensely frustrating because you'll be sitting there going, wow, this is completely unfair, but it's probably because you haven't learned all of the game's mechanics yet and you don't really know how to properly defend yourself yet. So they definitely made some pretty glaring mistakes with the general game design here, because you don't want to have missions like that opening up to the player until they've had a chance to at least get through the tutorial. But what about the actual mechanics themselves? Well, they're pretty sloppy. They're actually even more sloppy than Jump Force was, which is pretty impressive considering this came out the same year as Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4, which may not have been all that impressive of a game compared to Ultimate Ninja Storm 3, but mechanically it is this style of gameplay done quite well. They learned from their mistakes with previous games, and they refined the mechanics to the point where they actually feel pretty good in Ninja Storm 4. Here, on the other hand, it's like Spike Chunsoft just weren't communicating with CyberConnect 2 at all, which they probably weren't, and as a result, the mechanics are just so unrefined by comparison that it makes this feel like a game that came out more around the time of, say, Ultimate Ninja Storm 1. It's a pretty rough experience, and that's even discounting the fact that it's a One Piece game, which means that the only people who are going to be able to get anything out of it are One Piece fans. And nowhere is this more evident than when you start the story mode up, and you realize immediately that you have no idea what's going on. Because, as it turns out, the story of Burning Blood apparently takes place about halfway through where the manga is currently. And for those of you who are not familiar with One Piece, the manga is currently well over 1,000 chapters with no end in sight. I have long lamented the issue of Japanese works of media, whether it be manga, anime, games, whatever, having really nasty pacing issues, but One Piece is among the worst offenders in that regard. It just drags things out to a completely ridiculous degree, and that constant spinning of wheels is just absolutely migraine-inducing, so it's basically an insufferable story to try to read. And the sad part about that is that if you decide to try watching the anime because you think that the pacing issues are not present, they're actually even worse in the anime. The anime actually drags things out even more than the manga does, which is legitimately impressive. But anyway, I'm digressing here. The point is that the story of Burning Blood takes place about halfway through where the manga currently is as I'm recording this video, and as such, people who aren't familiar with it are going to be completely lost as to what's going on, who any of the characters are, why we should care about any of them, why anybody's doing what they're doing, and more importantly, why everything is so completely over the top and ridiculous. I don't think One Piece fans truly appreciate just how insane this series looks to an outsider. I mean, we can understand the pursuit of this legendary treasure and the desire of Luffy to be the Pirate King. We can understand things like Luffy is trying to rescue his brother Ace from being executed. Okay, that makes sense. But that's about as far as an uninitiated person is really going to be able to get before their brain just shuts off to the story entirely and they start skipping all of the cutscenes because none of it makes sense to them. And even if you do that and you get into the battles themselves, a lot of the character designs are just so utterly ridiculous that not only can you not take them seriously, but it tends to go far enough to where it goes past being kind of charming and funny and just becomes outright annoying. It is an extremely off-putting series to even attempt to get into, both from just how ridiculously long it is, as well as how over-the-top it is, and how annoying the characters can be. And so a game like Burning Blood is just not going to appeal to a wider audience unless they can just shut their brain off and focus entirely on the mechanics. And even if they do that, there are just plain better options out there. And then, of course, for somebody like me who outright can't stand One Piece, playing something like this is just downright miserable. You may be asking yourself, well, DW, if you can't stand One Piece, why did you even bother with this game in the first place? Well, I got a copy of it in a Humble Bundle, and I figured I'd give the game a try and see if I could at least enjoy it on a mechanical level. But since I can't even do that because there are just plain better games out there for this style of gameplay, well, the experience of trying to play Burning Blood was just downright miserable. So I really can't recommend this game to anybody out there unless you're just already a die-hard One Piece fan, in which case you probably already own a copy of this anyway. If you're not a fan of One Piece though, then definitely avoid this one entirely. And last up for this particular video, we have Sword Art Online Lost Song, developed by Art Dink and published by Bandai Namco, and released in 2015 for PS3, PS Vita, and then PS4, and finally it was released on PC in 2018. And as far as the gameplay mechanics go, it basically plays out like a fairly mindless hack-and-slash game, where you're running around and you're beating the crap out of mobs and such like that. And while your character levels do go up over time, it doesn't seem to actually do anything, at least not as far as I was playing, which wasn't very long because it very quickly became extremely boring. I think at one point I accidentally skipped a line of dialogue that told me what I needed to do next in the quest, but at that point I didn't really care all that much what was going on in the quest anyway, so I spent the remainder of my time just wandering around, beating the crap out of things, and just finding loot drop stuff. And while the game did have some neat things going on with the ability to float and fly around at a relatively high speed and get some pretty serious altitude with the floating islands and such, unfortunately the combat mechanics themselves are just really boring. It's mostly just mashing the attack button until things fall over. And while you can try to vary things up by either using light or heavy attacks, you can just mash buttons and eventually things will just phase out of existence. And it really wasn't helping that it's Sword Art Online, and what exists as far as plot in this game is basically, oh hey, there's a new expansion in our VR MMO. Let's find out what new stuff is in this expansion. As far as plot goes, it may as well not even have one. There's basically no stakes there, and it just ends up being completely pointless. And then there's the whole fact that it's Sword Art Online, which is just so obnoxiously generic that it's downright boring. And Lost Song is really no different in that regard. It's just bland and boring, and really the only people who could possibly enjoy it are people who are already fans of Sword Art Online. It's not even really something you can enjoy much on a mechanical level unless you're already a fan of Sword Art Online, because it really is relying almost exclusively on its licensed property instead of the actual gameplay mechanics, which are just really weak. Supposedly the sequel is better, but honestly at this point, I really don't care. I'm not gonna bother picking up the sequel, both because I don't like Sword Art Online, although unlike in the case of One Piece, where it outright irritates me, in Sword Art Online's case, it's just boring and I don't care about it, so I really don't see any reason to try to pick up any of the other games in the series. I do have Fatal Bullet, but that was included in a Humble Bundle or some other bundle that I picked up at some point. It's been quite a while since I ended up getting a copy of that, so I don't remember exactly which bundle it was. But suffice to say, that'll probably be the last Sword Art Online game I cover on the channel, because since I don't care about Sword Art Online, it really falls to gameplay mechanics to keep me interested, and if the games in the series are more like this, and are just this really dull, generic hack-and-slash crap, then I'm not gonna find them interesting, and there's not really any point to me even giving them a try. And, well, that's about all I have to say for this video. And perhaps I should have expected the licensed tie-in games to not be particularly good, but I've been proven wrong on that before. I mean, the Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm games, at least 3 and 4 anyway, were actually pretty solid games. They weren't amazing or anything, but they were decent enough for what they were. And several of the Dragon Ball games have been pretty good, and I'm not even a fan of Dragon Ball. But in this particular case, with these particular games, it just didn't pan out, unfortunately. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.